Welcome to the session on early analytical philosophy of language. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and Wittgenstein. In the last unit, we have discussed the emergence of philosophy of language and its early history. We have also looked at Russell's theory of descriptions and Freud's concept of sense and reference. These two philosophers were a great influence on the philosophy of language. Both Russell and Freud were pioneers in setting an agenda for the later analytical philosophers. Such an agenda promised to give solutions to philosophical difficulties that long existed. It also attempted to preserve a role for philosophy that was equal to the natural sciences. This gave inspirations to the European and American academic philosophers. As a result, philosophers started inquiring into the questions of language and meaning more and more. This led to lots of changes and transformations in the early to mid-20th century. This stage of philosophy of language can be called the second stage, characterized by the works of Wittgenstein, logical positivists, and Tarski. In this unit, we will look at 3 points of interest in the early phases of this tradition: the early work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the logical positivists, Tarski's theory of truth. Ludwig Wittgenstein and the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus. Ludwig Joseph Johann Wittgenstein was an Austrian philosopher. He is considered as inspiration for the century's principal philosophical movements, namely logical positivism and ordinary language philosophy. In his lifetime, he published just one book review, one article, a children's dictionary, and the 75-page Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. His posthumously published Philosophical Investigations, which was published in 1953, was considered as the most important book of 20th century philosophy. He is considered by some to be the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. His influence can be seen in contemporary philosophical thoughts such as logic and language, perception and intention, ethics and religion, aesthetics and culture. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is the Latin term for logical philosophical treatise. It is the only book-length philosophical work published by the Ludwig Wittgenstein in his lifetime. In this seminal work, he tries to identify the relationship between language and reality. He also attempts to define the limits of science in it. It is recognized as one of the most important philosophical works of the 20th century. This work is commonly called Tractatus. In Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he raises questions regarding what philosophy is and what it is meant to do. In other words, it emphasized on the role of philosophy. According to the Tractatus, we should view philosophy as a kind of clarifying activity. It was argued that philosophy cannot step outside the boundaries of language. So the best thing philosophy can do is to clear vague propositions within language. Ludwig Wittgenstein came to read Freud and Russell out of an interest in the foundations of mathematics. He went to Cambridge to study with Russell. He studied there but left to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army in 1914. He was held as a prisoner of war, and during that time he wrote drafts of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. This book contains his 7 propositions. Tractatus is structured around these 7 propositions. He made detailed comments on 6 of them, with extensive comments on the comments. He laid out a plan to systematically analyze the logical structure of language and thought. Through logical analysis, Wittgenstein argued that we could arrive at a conception of language. His conception of language consisted of elementary propositions related by the elements of first-order logic. Any sentence with a sense could have that sense in a clear manner, and any sentence that did not yield to such analysis would not have a sense at all. He argued that everything that can be thought at all can be thought clearly. Everything that can be said clearly. By this, Wittgenstein does not mean that we cannot string together words in unclear ways. Rather, he meant that by stringing together words in an unclear manner, we do not express anything that has a sense. That is, such expressions do not convey anything meaningful. This is considered as one of the major theorizations on meaning. In his early life, Wittgenstein held the view that prepositions picture the world. This is not to say that an expression or a sentence visually resembles the things it expresses. For example, consider the following sentences. Elvin Jones played drums for John Coltrane. This sentence does not look like Elvin Jones or John Coltrane or a drum set. On the other hand, the expression Elvin Jones played drums for John Coltrane looks like the form of some fact of the world. In order to understand this as a picture of the world, we require a coordination of elements in the picture with outside objects. Where we can establish this coordination, the language is starting something clearly, and hence the statement is meaningful. In cases where we cannot establish a coordination of the elements in the picture with objects in the outside world, we are not saying anything at all. However, this is not to say that everything about meaning and our understanding of the world was a matter of explicit definition. Many things can only be shown without being said. For instance, think of a logical expression like and. Any attempt to explain its sense, like putting two things side by side or using another term like both, only repeats the structure of and. Thus, such an attempt will be adding nothing new to the already existing term. Wittgenstein also had a number of views at the end of the Tractatus on the solipsism, the will, and ethics. These remain some of the most difficult and contested points of interpretation in his work. Wittgenstein closed the Tractatus without further comment by saying, "Whereof we cannot speak, we must remain silent." The Vienna Circle and the logical positivists. We have already dealt with logical positivism in a separate unit. In this unit, we will look at the role played by logical positivism in the philosophy of language. Logical positivism originated from the Vienna Circle. Vienna Circle is the name given to a group of leading philosophers, mathematicians and scientists who met in Vienna, Austria in the late 1920s and early 1930s. German philosopher Moritz Schlick chaired these meetings. This group met for informal philosophical discussions, and this led to the formation of the philosophical movements called the logical positivism. They put forward what they regarded as a scientific world conception. This conception was opposed to metaphysics. Metaphysics is a traditional branch of philosophy that deals with and explains the fundamental nature of being and the world. Logical positivism considered metaphysics as not truth, since it is based on abstract and not verifiable ideas and concepts. It applied scientific methods to philosophical inquiries and propositions. Among its members were Moritz Schlick, founder of the Vienna Circle, Rudolf Carnap, the leading figure of logical positivism, Hans Reichenbach, founder of the Berlin Circle, A.J. Ayer, Herbert Feigl, Philipp Frank, Kurt Grilling, Hans Hahn, Carl Gustav Hempel, Victor Kraft, Otto Neura, and Friedrich Waismann. The central tenet of logical positivism was the negation of metaphysical ideas. Logical positivism revived the scientific nature in philosophical inquiries. We can summarize logical positivism the following way. Vienna Circle's ideas gave importance to a certain rigorous way of thinking called logical analysis. They gave heavy emphasis to the techniques of modern formal logic. They rejected the Hegelian idealism prevalent in European academic circles. They followed the precision of science, particularly physics, as a model for their methods, and they took ideas from British empiricism. Rudolf Carnap was one of the famous members of Vienna Circle. Carnap adopted the insights of Freud's work. Freud's inspiration can be seen in Carnap's famous work titled The Logical Structure of the World. This was published in 1928. Logical positivism was influenced by many philosophical ideas and works. Wittgenstein's Tractatus is said to be one of the most important sources of inspiration for logical positivism. They shared Wittgenstein's concept of tautology, that is, some expressions are true in terms of internal relations among their prepositions. Such expressions need not be verified by any actual facts about the world. Logical positivism used these concepts to make analytic or synthetic distinction. Analytic sentences are sentences that are true in terms of the meanings of their constituent expressions. Example, all bachelors are unmarried. Synthetic sentences are true if and only if they can be verified by empirical acts and experience. Example, John is a bachelor. Analytic sentences would be confirmed by logical analysis, but synthetic sentences would be confirmed through observation sentences or sense data. Philosophy of language and verifiability principle. Logical positivism argued that a statement is meaningful only if it is either empirically verifiable or it should be tautological. That is, truth arises entirely from the meanings of its own terms. Logical positivism rejected the metaphysical statements of traditional philosophy as meaningless. It also rejected other kinds of statements including ethical, aesthetic and religious principles. Such statements and propositions are generally asserted as true, but they are not tautological or known from experience. Those statements are not true in themselves and their non-terms. They cannot be verified as true or false from observations either. They may be able to influence feelings, beliefs or conduct. But since they cannot be verified as being true or false, they do not generate knowledge. According to logical positivism, non-tautological statements become meaningful only if certain sets of observable conditions are relevant. Such conditions help to determine its truth or falsity. In other words, we can say that the meaning of a statement is a set of conditions under which it would be true. Simply put, a statement is meaningful if and only if it can be proved true or false, at least in principle, by means of experience. This assertion is called the verifiability principle. The work of philosophy was logical analysis and definition of the concept of the natural sciences into verificationist terms. We can imagine empirical verification of many things in the physical sciences, for example, laboratory results, predictions with observable consequences, etc. But it would be difficult in fields like psychology and ethics. In these cases, the positivists favored a type of logical reductionism. For example, all sentences and key concepts in psychology would be reduced to empirically verifiable sentences about the behavior of thinking subjects. A sentence about a mental state like anger would be reduced to sentences about observable behavior such as raising one's voice, facial expressions, becoming violent, and so on. This requires sentences of theoretical identity to equate the entities of psychology with the entities of physical sciences. In other words, it is a translation of the terms of older theories into new ones. Where this could not be done, they argued that the sentences in question were meaningless. They eliminated many canonical concepts, sentences, and theories of metaphysics. A sentence like God exists outside of space and time was not true in terms of the meanings of its terms. It cannot be verified through an empirical test, so they dismissed such sentences as meaningless. Verifiability principle was met with lots of objections and criticism too. Critics argued that verifiability principle was self-refuting. For example, any sentence stating the theory itself was neither analytical nor subject to empirical verification. As a result, it should be seen as either self-refuting or meaningless. There was a problem with universal generalizations including scientific laws. For example, consider the expression all electrons have a charge of 1.6 into 10 raised to minus 9 coulombs. This expression, according to the critics of verifiability principle, was problematic. It is not deducible from finite sets of observation sentences. Logical positivists did not recognize or realize the existence of this problem in the beginning. Later philosophers like Hempel and Carnap attempted to develop a version of the verifiability principle that would withstand criticism. But those efforts didn't become successful. Eventually, verifiability principle became only a recommendation. It could not be proved or supported with either logic or good argument. With that, the verifiability principle collapsed. Since verifiability principle has self-contradictory nature, philosophers do not hold to it any longer. Karl Popper came up with an opposition to verifiability principle. He was one of the leading figures of the philosophy of science. He tried to show that logical positivism had mixed two different problems. One is that of meaning and the other is that of demarcation, and they claimed that verifiability principle is a single solution to both. Popper argued that there are meaningful theories that are not scientific. In that case, a criterion of meaningfulness cannot coincide with a criterion of demarcation. As a solution to this problem, Popper came up with another principle called falsifiability. He argued that instead of verifiability principle, we should use falsifiability as a criterion of demarcation. Verifiability principle was a major turn in the history of philosophy of language. It gave a philosophy of language a new dimension based on empiricism. Verifiability principle actively addressed issues of language and meaning. Many later theories and positions in philosophy of language borrowed from the verifiability principle. Though we do not use verifiability principle as a criterion for meaning, these days we should admit the fact that it was one of the most influential doctrines in the history of philosophy of language. Tarski's theory of truth. Alfred Tarski was a Polish logician and mathematician. He is known for work on model theory, meta-mathematics, and algebraic logic. He also contributed to abstract algebra, topology, geometry, measure theory, mathematical logic, set theory, and analytic philosophy. In two seminal works published in 1933 and 1944, Alfred Tarski made a great leap forward for the rigorous analysis of meaning. He made his theory based in syntax and semantics. Syntax is the rules and structures governing the recombination of words and phrases into sentences, and the semantics is the study of language meaning. Philosophers were successful in analyzing syntax, but semantic notions like meaning or truth created a problem for philosophers. In his work, Tarski argued that semantics could be treated just as systematically as syntax could. Tarski attempted to develop an analysis of the concept of truth that does not contain any semantic notions. Instead, he based his definition of it in terms of syntax and set theory. He made a distinction between two kinds of language. They are meta-language and object language. An object language is the language that is our target for analysis. The meta-language is the language in which we conduct our analysis. In other words, meta-language is the language that we use to study another language, and the object language is the language that we study. For instance, when we learn a second language, we take classes where that second language is taught in our mother language. In this case, the second language is the object language and our mother tongue is the meta-language. Thus, copies of all the sentences of the object language should be included in a meta-language. A meta-language, according to this, should include sufficient resources to describe the syntax of the object language. In effect, an object language would not contain its own truth predicate. The truth predicate can occur only in a meta-language. On the basis of these arguments, he developed a theory called the semantic theory of truth. This was developed in 1930 in his paper titled On the Concept of Truth in Formal Languages. This theory tried to solve the problem in logic known as the liar paradox. In logic, liar paradox is a statement. The statement is false. If we try to prove this sentence as true or false, it will lead to a contradiction. That is, if the sentence is false is true, then the sentence is false, which would in turn mean that it is actually true, but this would mean that it is false and so on. Similarly, if this sentence is false, then the sentence is true, which would in turn mean that it is actually false, but this would mean that it is true and so on. Tarski argued that a definition of truth would have to be formally correct. Tarski's material adequacy condition, also known as convention T or T schema. It says that any viable theory of truth must entail for every sentence P of a language a sentence of the form T. P is true if and only if P. Here, P is the name of the sentence P in the meta-language, which is a translation of the corresponding sentence in the object language. For example, snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. In this sentence, the first half of the sentence is about the object language sentence snow is white. The second half is about snow itself. Tarski then offered a definition of truth. A sentence is true if it is satisfied by all objects and false otherwise. Tarski's ideas were taken up by later philosophers who contributed to the philosophy of language. Let us summarize the major points discussed here. In this unit, we looked at the development of philosophy of language in the 20th century. There were three major theorists who contributed to the philosophy of language in this period. They are Wittgenstein, logical positivists, and Alfred Tarski. Wittgenstein developed his ideas on language in his Tractatus. He argued for the clarity of propositions and believed that the role of philosophy is to clarify propositions and reject meaningless propositions. Verifiability principle of the logical positivism was heavily influenced by Wittgenstein ideas. According to verifiability principle, any proposition that cannot be verified through experience should be rejected as meaningless. Tarski tried to solve the liar paradox on logic by putting forward a new theory known as the semantic theory of truth. All three of these are seen as major developments in the history and growth of philosophy of language. Now, try to find out the answers for the given questions. What is the role of Wittgenstein in philosophy of language? What are the major concepts and contributions of Tractatus? What is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus? What is Vienna Circle? What is verifiability principle? Explain Tarski's semantic theory of truth. What is T schema or convention T? Explain its significance in solving philosophical problems. Book for your references: Philosophy of Language, A Contemporary Introduction by William G. Lycan, Routledge 2000. Hope that you have enjoyed this session. See you next time. Bye.